Welcome everyone to our second to last garden workshop. Amazing how time has flown. We started doing these in early April, I believe, when we realized that a lot of people were interested in turning to gardening to grow food and maybe to have something to do as well, and wanted some fundamental gardening skills. So these workshops are hosted by the Lynn Canyon Ecology Centre and really designed for those who are fairly new to gardening. So I'd like to welcome Christina, who is our support person today, who will hopefully be chiming in with a lot of things, her knowledge about how to keep plants healthy. And she has a business called Fluent Garden Consulting. And she helps you design and understand your small garden. And I'm from the Lynn Canyon Ecology Centre. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land that I am on right now. I know that we have the cool thing about people coming to web workshops is that we probably have people from all over the place, and we've had folks from Ontario coming in and things. Where I am, I'm on the traditional territory of the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish and Musqueam First Nation, and that's something I'm always thinking about, whether I'm out with kids or gardening, and thinking about how to be a steward in this place. So if you do have points of clarification as we go along, feel free to ask them in the chat, and Christina is going to be taking a look in the chat and maybe chatting you back, or maybe asking me or responding herself. And we will have about 5 to 10 minutes for questions at the end as well. So today's focus is on how to keep plants healthy. And I see there's a little pop-up saying that last week's video wasn't uploaded. I think it is, but I'll check the website and see. There was, I was explaining to Christina that there was an issue with with our account uploading video content, but I think last week's should have made it into the cloud, so maybe we just didn't have the right link or something. So I'll look into that later. Okay, so keeping your plants healthy. So we have all these plants, we hope, and we have them in our garden, or maybe we have them in our basement still under a lamp. And so today we're going to talk about how to keep our plants healthy and growing, and perhaps some things that could go wrong with our plants, and how to see if we can both fix those but also prevent them, because I think prevention in gardening is worth a lot more than having to go back and fix the problem. So I wanted to start with what a healthy plant looks like, and here's my little cartoon. So our healthy plant has a lot going on under the surface. So often we look at our plants, and of course we can't see under the ground normally, so we don't know exactly what's going on under there. But a huge amount of our plant's health has to do with the soil. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today has to do with soil and water and all that stuff that's helping the roots stay happy. So if you're looking in a potted plant, for example, and you're removing a plant from a pot, one thing you want to see is that the roots are white and they have lots of room to spread out and grow. So if you're working with container plants, what you don't want to see is little dried up pieces of root coming out of the bottom and getting all crumbly, because that means A, they don't have enough room, and B, they're not getting enough of what they need, like water. You want to have a plant with a relatively even color, unless it's not supposed to have an even color. Some plants don't. And lots of new growth, and just being conscious though that this time of the year, if you have a perennial plant, some perennial plants still haven't quite gotten all of their leaves. I have one that lives right near my garden. It's one that I transplanted a few years ago, and granted, it's not maybe the happiest plant. It was transplanted when it was a bit too large, and it tends to take a little bit longer to get leaves. So every year I panic and think that it's dead. And then every year, a couple weeks after that, I come back and go, oh, look, it has leaves. And partly that's because it isn't as happy as it could be, but also it's just a slower plant. And so you should have new growth, but also just realize that different plants start to grow leaves and flowers at different times of the year. And then you want your plant to look upright and fairly vigorous. And so it's not drooping over. And that its leaves, as I said, are an even color and not getting brown or crumbly or yellow, unless they're supposed to be yellow. So let's talk a bit about food for plants. And so this is where this soil comes in. And we're going to be talking about soil a lot today, because that's kind of like you talking about your diet, and what you eat really becomes, in a large part, who you're able to be. And the same thing with plants. So you might have heard about NPK when it comes to fertilizers, and those are some core parts of our fertilizer. So N is nitrogen, phosphorus, and then potassium. And they're all good for different things when it comes to plant growth. So nitrogen is more of an overall health and growth of the plant. Phosphorus is particularly for its roots. And then potassium has a number of other roles, like helping it maintain its water balance and resist pathogens and the cold. And you can get these from a lot of different places. So you can get your nutrients from something like this. I think Christina and I have both mentioned the organic fertilizers that we really like. This is one that I tend to use, is Gaia Green. And even though it says that it focuses on the nitrogen and the phosphorus and the potassium, it also has a lot of micronutrients. And so just like in your diet, if you're eating things, you might be thinking about like the fundamentals of diet, like protein and carbohydrates, but there's a lot of other things that you get from food that aren't those main things. And the same thing with plants. They need micronutrients to do all of their little processes that they're doing inside the plant as well. So this is great, this type of organic fertilizer, but having excellent soil that's really rich and full of compost, and maybe you've made it over the course of a winter with piles of leaves and that kind of thing, that's just as good or even better. And we can take a couple of approaches. One is we can take the approach of, all right, I'm gonna try and, as a human, really try and add more fertilizer to my garden, or I'm going to take a longer approach and set some stuff up over the fall and the winter and let nature really create that fertilizer. And either one, I've used both of them, either one is fine. You can also respond to specific things that you know that you're lacking in your garden with that immediate human intervention, and then use compost and soil building as the foundation of your garden. I don't know if, Christina, you wanted to jump in there with any nutrient thought. We're going to talk a bit about too much and too little of different things now.
I think that was a great summary. Yeah, just if you can slowly build soil over time and just have that as a part of your everyday like garden management practice, that's great. And then, yeah, as Tricia said, as things arise, and you can, jump in and, try to address, maybe plant stresses or deficiencies as they appear.
Yeah, exactly. So think about your fundamental health and how you can work with nature to do that, and then anything else you can work on remedying that. Now, one thing that I've noticed, even me, I've done this before. I've gone out and gotten really excited about things like manure, and gone, wow, manure is supposed to be great for your garden. Let's put a whole bunch of it on the garden. And while you can get really well-aged manure that is not quite as intense, if you're doing something like lasagna gardening, which we've talked about and I will talk about again, and you're making layers of leaves and manure, really make sure that you're not shocking your plants with too many nutrients. So sometimes we look at plants that look like this, their leaves are looking a little bit funky, and you go, oh, there must be missing something. But sometimes it's too much of a good thing that they have. So if you've added a ton of fertilizer, particularly the fast release fertilizer, then it actually dries out the leaves. And same sort of thing with if you add a whole bunch of manure, that you're just really enthusiastic about all these nutrients you're going to give your plants, and your plants just go, whoa, too much at one time. So try not to get overly enthusiastic when you're fertilizing. And on the other side, you can also look at your plants, and this plant looks like it might be missing something, or maybe it has too much of something. Probably this one is missing something. So there's just a few tips here about things that you might see. If you remember the different roles of different larger nutrients that the plants need, then you can note that nitrogen might lead to wilted leaves, potassium might lead to yellowing like this, calcium might lead to curling leaves. And as you look at if there's a consistent pattern with the problems that you're seeing in your plants, then you can always look that up and you can go, okay, I see all of the older leaves on my plants are turning yellow. So what's going on there? I wonder if I'm missing something, or maybe I got over enthusiastic with my fertilizer. And so we can then problem solve some of the things that you might be missing. And I noticed someone probably just came in. I'm just going to get you to mute yourself. I can't find you in there, but if you could mute yourself, that would be awesome. So we've been talking a lot about these lasagna gardening. I was trying to find a picture of some lasagna growing in a garden, but I'm not techie enough to create one. So lasagna gardening is the idea that you can create garden soil and happier plants by layering nutrients in your garden. And this is some really lovely cardboard that we've put down on the garden. And that cardboard just goes right over things like grass. We were talking the other day about how to do this when you have particularly invasive plants, and maybe removing some of them first would be an idea. But generally you can stick on most not too vigorously invasive plants, you can just stick some nice layers of cardboard on top and make sure that the cardboard overlaps, and then put layers of things like leaves and manure. And there's lots of different recipes online for how to create this lasagna gardening. But this creates this slow release fertilizer over time that's really going to keep your plants happy. One thing that I didn't mention in here is the idea of hugelkultur, which we talked about the other day, which is just a really awesome name. But hugelkultur is something I'm trying in my garden again this year. It's when you bury wood or you plant on top of old wood. And that allows not only your plants to have the nutrients from the decomposing wood, but also decomposing wood holds a lot of moisture in it. And so you get nutrients and moisture in a way that would naturally occur in nature, right? Things naturally grow on other things. And especially if you live in this temperate rainforest environment and you're trying to grow plants like blueberries that naturally grow in a temperate rainforest environment, then that is a great way to grow plants like that, because they love to grow on old wood and they love the acidity of old wood. So as you build up your nutrients in your yard, think about, if you choose to use fertilizer, slow release fertilizer like that Gaia Green one that I showed you. Think about your micronutrients as well as the big ones. Add compost. If you have a compost bin in your yard still, you don't have to use it for food scraps anymore, but you can just put your old leaves in it and your garden clippings and things, and that gives you a great source of free materials for your garden next year. And then layering leaves, manure, and that kind of thing in lasagna gardening. And then the other thing, which we'll talk about in a minute, is not digging too much. And I know we all get really excited in the springtime. We want to go out and stick our hands in soil, which is really good for us. And we do that. You know, we're putting our plants in the ground. There's definitely some tilling that or movement of soil that happens there. But in general, you don't actually have to go and dig up your entire garden every spring and plant stuff. The soil is doing its own thing, and it's really complicated. And it likes to have holes where water and air can go in. And that allows the roots to get in there. And so you actually, by not tilling, you let the soil do its natural thing. And that's great. And it continues to maintain its nutrients. The nutrients don't just flow off the side of your garden because you've moved the soil around and now all the nutrients are flying away. And you maintain that soil structure. I noticed there are a few comments. Was there anything that needed clarification, or should we wait till later, Christina?
It was just about the spelling of hugelkultur.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's my test for this morning. Hugelkultur, I think.
Ding, ding, ding,
Yeah.
ding, ding.
Is
Yeah.
that right?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
At least that's
All
what I
right.
pasted
I
in. Yeah.
win. I
Yay.
win. Okay. So one thing I was collecting photos of garden beds, and I've been looking at people, like a lot of people are putting garden beds on their front lawns, which is awesome. I walk around in the morning and I look at people's gardens. I'm like, oh, cool, they're growing tomatoes on their front yard. And one thing that I've done in the past, again, like a mistake that I've made, is I've gotten really excited about making an enormous garden bed. And when we're talking about things that plants need to grow, a lot of the things that plants need to grow are the same things that humans need. So we need nutrients, plants need nutrients, we need air, soil needs air, plants need air. And so we want the soil to have lots of holes in it so that water and air can get in there. And that means, we already talked about avoiding digging too much, but also it means not stepping on the soil too much. And so if you're making things like garden beds and you need to reach into them a lot, make sure that you stick out your arm, and from any side of your garden bed, you're able to get into the middle of your garden bed. Because if you end up having to jump into your garden bed all the time, then you really disrupt the soil structure and you damage the roots of your plants and all the stuff that's going on. Suddenly you have these big feet pounding on it all the time. Now, I have made the mistake of having a really big garden bed in the past, and what I've done is I've made a path through the middle. And so you can do that if you have this enormous garden bed and you don't want to change it, or you can't change it, then just make a place where you walk. And I put little paving stones in there, so I know where to walk and everyone else who's going in there knows where to walk. And then another thought is just sometimes we need to protect our soil from the weather. And one way to do that is by using plants. And so having soil that's out and baking in the heat all the time is probably not the best for keeping the air and the water flow and the nutrients in the soil. So I like to cover my soil with as many plants as possible. And that prevents all the weeds from coming in because I've just planted stuff there. And it also protects it from getting really well baked in the summer sun. And I was telling Christina earlier on that my garden tends to be a couple of degrees colder because I'm further up the mountain than she is. But it also is in a place that gets really, really, really hot in the summer. So if I don't put something on it, then it will just get baked in the sun. So that's always something to consider if you have a really hot garden. And a lot of us like to put our gardens in the places that are really warm because we like to grow stuff like tomatoes. So a few things about watering. So plants also need water. And this might seem counterintuitive, but if you think about how rain works, rain works in different ways. Sometimes it rains a lot. Sometimes it rains consistently over a day. Sometimes it just drizzles. Often the rain is, here anyway, a fairly consistent rain and over a long period of time. And so when I'm watering, I like to think about, how can I be like the rain? So how can I water really thoroughly, but maybe a little less frequently? And I wish that I'd added a photo of some plant roots. So if you have a plant and your plant has its roots down in the soil here, and you just water a little bit every day, then the water just goes down that little bit into the soil. And then your plant roots, their job is to seek out the water and the nutrients. So they're going to hang out right over here because that's where all the good stuff is. If you water in a deep way, then the plants, their roots will go down and they'll seek that deeper down water. So you're going to get a plant with better root structure. And so watering more deeply and less frequently is a good plan. And one guideline, I was trying to look up some handy guidelines for how you can tell if you've watered enough. And the one that I really liked was up to the first knuckle. So I know all of our hands are a little bit different, but if you stick your finger down in there and you go, oh wow, the bottom of my finger is still really, really dry, then you might not have watered deeply enough. And then of course, all this really depends on your container and your soil. So if you're in a garden, then it's quite different than if you're have a plant in a pot on your deck, and maybe that plant really needs a lot of water, like a tomato plant. If it was a tomato plant on in a well-drained pot on my deck, then I would be watering it really frequently. So look to your plant for cues as well. So you want to look at how much water does your plant need, and also what is your container and your growing medium like. And then I tend to try and water in the morning. Try and water without going on the leaves. And that's because, first of all, watering in the morning is, you get up and you have a glass of water. They're not working as hard at night, these plants, so they want to have that water during the day. And if you find they're really getting desiccated, like very late in the afternoon, you could maybe give them a little bit more. And then not watering on the leaves, particularly like you go out, it's, I don't know, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it's really hot, your plants look thirsty, so you just pour a whole bunch of water on them. But then when you do that, if the water goes on your leaves, then it can actually turn into a little magnifying glass and magnify that light and hurt your plants. So it also goes poof up in the air because your soil's so hot that you've just watered the air and you haven't watered the plants all that much. So I think I mostly mentioned these already. Drainage, we like to not step on our garden too much. We like to have a well-drained soil. That's one of the things that you'll often see on the seed packages, right? Is put these into some moist, well-drained soil. And you go, how do I get this moist, well-drained soil of which you speak? And again, it's all that compost, manure, leaves, like working over time to build complexity. And there's the same solution for clay soils that are clay and compacted and soils that are really sandy, is you just want more complexity. So you want more organic materials like compost and manure and leaves in there. And when I mention all those things, those are maybe not a right now thing, they're a later in the fall thing. So the time when we get leaves is the time when we want to start using them on our gardens. So the leaves fall from the trees, and then you're going to use them as a nice blanket for your garden over the winter, and you can pile other things on top of them and they'll make you some soil over the winter. So gardening is more of a long game than a short one sometimes. And just in terms of drainage too, so if you find you have super well-drained soil, or in this case, not very well-drained soil, also the permaculture solution to that is to think about what plants like to live there. So if you have a really soggy area in your garden, you might want to have things like ferns and rushes and violets, and maybe some beneficial insect attracting plants that love the wet, like bee balm. And then some herbs, like the more things that we often call Mediterranean herbs, really like hot places. So rosemary and lavender, for example, they get mad growing in my garden over the winter because it just gets too cold up here and they get snow and they don't like that. But in the summertime, if they're in a hot place in my garden, then that's okay. They don't mind being a bit hot and dry, and they're quite hardy. And so if you notice, the other thing is temperature. So again, think about plants, think about humans. We like to be kind of a medium temperature. Some of us prefer the heat, some of us prefer the cold. Some plants love heat, tomatoes and squashes and peppers, all those ones that you think of, often like the ones that we think of as the three sisters as well, like the squashes and the beans. They love to be warm. And if you find that it's not warm enough yet for them, you can use things like cloches. This is an example of a cloche made up of a pop bottle, but you can put other things over top of it, really something that lets the air and things through, but keeps it a bit warmer. It's like a mini greenhouse. And then other things really hate to grow in the heat, particularly leafy greens like lettuces. They will bolt, which means they panic and they send out their seeds and they make long parts to them, and they go, oh my goodness, this is just too hot for me. I'm not going to survive. I need to reproduce now. And that then makes your leafy greens really bitter and it's harder to eat them. So you want to make sure that whatever you're growing, you grow in the right place. But also, if you find that, say you have a container of lettuce and it was great in April to have it in this one place, but wow, in May and into June, it gets really hot in that spot. Then you can just move them over. And you can also reseed some lettuce in places that are cooler. So that way you keep them happy as you go along. And then the last little bit is your animals that you want to invite to the garden. So pollinators are really important for overall plant happiness. Often we think of bees, but there are many other pollinators. Some plants are even pollinated by beetles, and some plants are pollinated by hummingbirds. And one thing that I really like to use in my garden in abundance is herbs. So a lot of herbs are like oregano, for example. I went out to my community garden plot a year or two ago, I can't remember, and I was just sitting there watching the oregano, which was blooming, and I think I saw 4 different species of bees at the same time. And it was really awesome. And I was just thinking, some people, they get annoyed with oregano because it's overly abundant. But hey, you can make a lot of spaghetti sauce. And also it really attracts the pollinators. So even if I didn't want to make a lot of spaghetti sauce, I would just have it there because of all of those pollinators who come to that plant. And the same with a lot of other garden herbs. So think about what you would like to eat, but also think about what might attract some pollinators to your yard. And then the very last thing is those pest management. So we talked a bit about the plants that might have funky looking leaves, and maybe that's too many nutrients or too few nutrients. But you can also plant things that will attract animals that eat the bugs. So you can start to create this whole ecosystem in your yard. So one thing you can do, for example, is the fennel. This is a little fennel plant, attracts ladybugs. And I remember as a kid, I saw so many ladybugs on my parents' fennel. I would chew on the fennel. I'd have to make sure that I didn't eat any of the ladybugs. And ladybugs love to eat aphids, which are these little creatures up here. The other thing that I've done in addition to attracting beneficials is I've also used plants like this. This is a fava bean. And I've also used them as trap crops, which is kind of a permaculture way of thinking about your plants. So if you notice that you tend to have a lot of aphids and you've planted so many plants to attract ladybugs and you still have a lot of aphids, just have a little section over here of something that attracts tons of aphids like fava beans, and then just say, okay, those are the fava beans that the aphids have. And I'll have everything else in the garden. And I've tried that a few times when I've been frustrated by pests, and it's actually worked quite well. So the aphids have this little party over here with the fava beans, and then they mostly left all of my other ones alone because I just gave them their preferred food. So we have a few minutes for questions at the end. So I'll head over to Christina, and Christina, feel free to give the first crack at answering questions, and I can chime in as well.
Yeah, so I just answered one. So that's about, I guess, raised planter beds and whether or not, it's good to have a membrane at the bottom. So I addressed that one just by saying that generally it's better not to have like a closed bottom. We talked about that before when planning out a raised bed, just because it prohibits a lot of the interactions that your plants have with the natural soil underneath. And for me, one big thing is drainage. So depending on what the material of this membrane is, it can actually stop a lot of water from draining properly into the soil. And what you end up with is a big soupy mess. And when you have too much water in a contained area, you lose a lot of the oxygen space, and the plant roots need oxygen to sustain a healthy plant. And also, what was it? And then related to that question with the raised beds is no-till doable in a raised bed? And yeah, absolutely. I mean,
just don't do it.
Yeah, just don't till. Like if you don't need to flip clumps of stuff in your bed, then just just take the hands-off approach. What I've been doing a lot lately is cutting down plants at their base at the end of the season. So your tomato plants, your squashes, just cut them above the soil surface. And, you can take the tops and put them in your compost, and then leave the roots, because what actually happens is that with the moisture that we get in the fall, things break down, and that just adds organic material to your soil, which not only gives you a lot of nice nutrients from those plants, they break down and they add to real nice soil structure, which is really important for like a food garden situation.
One thing I was mentioning, I think last week, is you can also do that if you have really compacted soil. You could intentionally plant things that have deep roots. Like daikon has been used to do that. Daikon is a very big radish, and it is very fleshy, so it breaks down very easily. So you could even plant those with the intention that they're going to break into your compacted soil, and they'll do some of that work of breaking down the soil for you, adding nutrients, adding air and water places for that to go.
Mm-hmm. And there's a question about coffee grounds, and I guess with the talk about like composting and lasagna gardening and what is green and brown material, a lot of people are, I've read a lot of stuff floating around about the use of coffee grounds. I personally don't do it, or at least not like straight into the bed. That's, I think, generally not a recommended way, but I don't do that. I don't have the personal experience. It's just that I use like a big mix of stuff. I would add it to a compost. What I do at home is also bokashi composting, which is a totally different thing. I don't know if people are aware of that. We've talked about, I think, cold compost, hot compost, and bokashi is like a fermentation process. So I would put it in a system like that if you don't have like a big compost heap. Tricia, do you have anything to add to that? I'm just trying
Yeah,
to like dig through my brain.
I don't have violent opinions about putting coffee grounds or not. I mean, I think anytime you put things in your garden, it's good to think about where they come from. So the same thing with manure, right? So if you're getting manure from a farm directly, and they use a ton of medications or antibiotics, or it's not organic, like just thinking about that, because all of those things will go into your garden. And or what are you making your planter boxes out of? So just thinking about the unseen elements of what you're putting in your garden. And I have put coffee grounds in my garden, but not in, like, I drink coffee but not that much. so I have never noticed any ill effects from them, and I haven't done it in huge bulk either. So yeah.
Right. So I guess that's the thing. Like, you have to think about the amount that you're throwing in. Like, I've seen photos online where people, maybe they've gone to their local coffee shop and they've asked like for a big sack of coffee grounds, and they just dump it on their plants. And like, I don't really know what the growing situation is, but I would think that maybe the plant would be like, okay, what is being tossed on my soil? And they may have some adverse reaction. Tricia talked about, when you add nutrients, like in the form of like fertilizers, sometimes too much is maybe not a good thing. So it's really knowing your situation, knowing the plant, and then just being very mindful of, what exactly are you trying to do by putting like X into your growing situation.
And I'd say things like moderation and time are all good. So especially the time. So if you're doing something in the fall and then you're waiting for a long time, then probably that's all going to even out. And whereas if you're dumping it directly on a plant, then that's probably is a bit more shocking to the plant.
Okay, I think we're going to love this one. What plants do you recommend for ground cover? We love ground cover.
Let's see. Well, it depends how high you like your ground cover. So I'd probably go for something like a herb of sorts. Like I have used oregano as a ground cover before, like a low growing oregano. And it also depends, like, are you stepping on the ground cover? If you're looking for it for more of a lawn, like you might choose something like thyme or clover, that's a bit more durable and not as bushy. So yeah, I would go for herbs. and Kinnikinnick is another one that I've used. It's bearberry. Trailing blackberry is lovely, but very delicate. And little tiny strawberries. Yeah, lots of different things. Go ahead, Christina. I'm sure you have other ideas.
Yeah, I was just gonna say strawberry. So yeah, depending on if it's going to see foot traffic or not. Like a lot of the things are more succulent. I wouldn't be trampling all over strawberries just because they're very, they flower and they fruit and they have other benefits. For me, if I'm going to be adding something to cover, let's say, bare patches in a veggie garden, I would use nasturtiums, whether you want to use that as a trap crop or if you want to use that to just like bring in beneficials, or maybe you want to eat it. So that's like an edible and like multi-purpose ground cover. And, it could be good for beds. It could be good for other areas that maybe you just don't have time to deal with. So a lot of uses for that. And you mentioned clover for like sort of like a lawn
Pollinators.
yeah,
Yeah. Things that you're going to stick your feet on.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Ground covers and anything like clover, and what's the other one I was thinking of, but like clover, in addition to everything above the soil, underneath the soil, what a lot of the clovers and all the bean family things have in common, under the soil they have these little nodules that are nitrogen fixing. So if you are wanting to do no-till, if you want to plant something like field peas in an area, you can let that grow, you can let them flower, and that feeds the pollinators. You can chop them down at the end of the season and leave the roots where they are, because all that nitrogen that the plant naturally accumulates in the roots will stay in your soil, and that actually naturally gives you more nitrogen. So that's one thing I really love in veggie areas that I'm not really actively dealing with.
So we probably have time for one or two more questions. And I think I see a couple more things of
eggshells. I've heard eggshells added to tomato plants is helpful. Comments?
Yeah, I've added eggshells to my compost for calcium, and also just for, I needed to compost my eggs. They do take longer to break down. Mm-hmm. So you will notice even when you compost them thoroughly, like you'll still have little bits sometimes after everything else is gone. I know some people like them for slugs as well. I'd imagine they're fairly annoying to the slugs. So yeah, I haven't used them specifically on tomatoes, more because I'm not doing my tomatoes in closed containers. I'm doing them in bigger beds. But have you used them specifically for tomatoes? I'd imagine like micronutrient wise, they'd probably have a fair bit of calcium in them. So
yeah, like I've never used them myself, but I know people look for fertilizers, or they look for like natural sources of calcium to prevent blossom end rot, specifically in tomatoes. I haven't really had to do that. I don't eat a lot of eggs actually, so I don't have a lot of eggshells. So again, maybe it's the moderation thing. If you want to try it out, just don't go bananas with like loading your area with tons of eggshells. Give it a try, see if the plant responds. The thing is, and Tricia just mentioned it, it does take time for it to break down. So if you still see the eggshells sitting in your soil, it's likely not going to be contributing much, if any, micronutrients to your tomato plants. Time wise,
yeah, probably one more, I think.
Ants. Do we want to address ants?
Sure. Yeah. I think in terms of ants, I mean, they may be coming to visit your aphids. I noticed that ants tend to come out in the garden when there's been a hot, dry spell. So you probably notice a lot more ants. I think they can build their tunnels a little bit more thoroughly at that point. So at this point, I'd imagine I have also been noticing ants. This is when they come out, and I'm not super worried about them. I don't have a ton of them, and it's not like they're doing anything to my garden or my house really. And also that the damp weather that we're having right now will probably make the numbers subside a bit. Did you have any thoughts on the ants?
Yeah, same thing as you. Like they like, I mean, for me personally, they're not bothering me, and I do see them in the garden on the sunnier days. For me, when I look at insects, I think of them as a part of the, the ecosystem. You're building a garden, you're injecting a lot of plants, you want to be in touch with nature. And a part of like all of that is, the birds and the insects and the other creatures that are naturally going to visit your area. So for me, I think of, you've probably seen the ant eggs, like maybe that's food for, the birds or other creatures. So I try not to, mess with, the insects unless they're
Yeah.
really doing something detrimental to like the crops, and then I'll find a natural way to, remedy that at that point.
Yeah, and one thing we mentioned, I think it was last week, as we were, or maybe 2 weeks ago actually, is we were talking about creating garden ecosystems. And so if you're concerned about the balance of invertebrates that you have in your garden, like really intentionally trying to add shrubs and berries and attract birds. And so by creating this more complex ecosystem in your yard, then you create the conditions for everything to stay relatively balanced. And yeah, I think that's one of my learnings over time. So thank you very much. And thank you to Christina.
Thanks,
All
everyone.
right. Okay. Bye bye.
Bye.